Everyone, thank you so much for your patience. It looks like the attendee list has kind of started to slow down in terms of add-ons, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar, The Smallest Victims of the Wildlife Trade, Ending the Sale of Wild Animals in Pet Stores. Every year, tens of thousands of wild animals, including parrots, turtles, lizards, and snakes, are bred in cruel commercial breeding operations, also known as mills, like puppy mills, or captured from their homes to be sold as pets in stores. Today, we'll learn some of those animal stories and how you can help them. Next slide. I'm Cameron Harsh, the US Programs Director for World Animal Protection. And before we get started, we also want to make sure we take a moment to introduce you, if you're not familiar, to World Animal Protection. We are a global animal welfare protection organization with offices in 12 different countries. We focus on protecting animals in the wild and in farming, and we have been active since 1950, previously as the World Society for the Protection of Animals until 2014. Next slide. Our mission is to move the world to protect animals. Next. And our vision is a world where animals live free from suffering. Next slide. So joining us today are Liz Cabrera-Holtz, Wildlife Campaign Manager at World Animal Protection. We also have Karen Windsor, Co-founder and Executive Director at Foster Parrots and the New England Exotic Wildlife Sanctuary, and Emily Hovermail, Director of Government Affairs at the Humane Rescue Alliance. There will be time at the end of the presentations for questions, but as the speakers present, please feel free to add your questions at any time using the Q&A function. Finally, just a note that some of the photos and video used in the presentations do contain imagery that feature injured, sick, and captive animals. These images are being used to demonstrate the reality for these animals, and we do appreciate your understanding and your continued participation. Next slide. So first presenting will be Liz Cabrera-Holtz, the Wildlife Campaign Manager for World Animal Protection in the US. Liz.
Thanks, Cameron. So, next slide, please. So millions of wild animals are intensively bred in captivity or taken from their homes in the wild to be sold as pets every single year, from turtles to otters to monkeys to lions. And this trade hurts animals, biodiversity, and even threatens public health. But today I'm going to focus on the smaller wild animal species, the animals who are so often forgotten, who are sold in pet stores like Petco and PetSmart, such as red-eared sliders, bearded dragons, and parakeets. So unfortunately, these animals are often viewed as less charismatic and receive less attention than the tiger cubs and baby monkeys we hear about so much in the wildlife trade, but they're suffering equally and in much, much higher numbers. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of some of the problems associated with the sale of wild animals in stores, as well as any animal in a store. It contributes to the deadly wildlife trade, pushes more animals into already overwhelmed shelters, harms biodiversity, threatens public health, and these sales rely on cruel breeding mills. Next slide. So a very quick overview on the wildlife trade. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that's fueling the extinction or decline of numerous species. It's estimated to affect 1 in 4 mammal and bird species globally. And we often think of it as someone else's problem, that it's happening in other countries or other continents like Asia and Africa. But the reality is that we, the United States, are the main problem. You can see in this image, which is based on a recent study that came out, that the US is the biggest importer of wildlife on the planet. And a major reason for that is because people in the US are demanding wild animals for use as pets. Next slide. So as I mentioned in the overview slide, this really impacts shelters because, and you know, as many of you probably know, local governments are responsible for caring for the animals in municipal shelters, and the retail sale of animals being sold in stores, expands the number of animals flowing into the community, increasing the already incredible burden on these shelters, and as well as taxpayers who have to pay for the cost of their care. MSPCA, a shelter in Boston, reported that 1 in 4 people surrendering a small animal or a bird purchased them at a pet store. And this problem is further exacerbated with wild animals because pet stores often market wild animals as beginner or easy to keep or appropriate for children. And really the opposite is true. These animals have long lifespans and complicated care requirements that are often very expensive. Next slide. The trade in wild animals for use as pets also hurts biodiversity. Wild animals formerly kept as pets are now a major cause of the spread of non-native species and have already resulted in the establishment of several hundred invasive animal species. This is a welfare issue because when animals are abandoned outdoors, some of them are killed quickly by predators, starvation, exposure, but it's also devastating for ecosystems because these animals will introduce disease and bacteria to animals who don't have immunity to them. They also compete with native animals for food and habitat. The red-eared slider has become an emblem of this problem. It's sold by both, red-eared sliders are sold by both Petco and PetSmart. They have a major negative impact on native turtle populations, and their sale or possession is actually now banned in multiple jurisdictions. Public health is also implicated because when we keep wild animals as pets, when we sell them, it forces them into close proximity with humans and other species they would never meet naturally. These animals are also highly stressed. They're being held in unsanitary conditions, so they're more susceptible to contracting and transmitting disease. Next slide. I also want to talk quickly about the cruelty in these mills. So if Mackenzie, if you could play this video that gives you a quick overview.
Why sell one but adopt the other? The two biggest pet stores in the US, PetSmart and Petco, continue to sell animals like lizards, turtles, birds, and hamsters while promoting adoption through their charities. Pet stores rely on cruel mills where animals suffer. Similar to puppy mills, animals are intensively bred in low welfare conditions. Help us take the first step to ending animal sales at worldanimalprotection.us/WNP.
So as that video kind of explained, pet stores rely on either dealers that import wild animals or on commercial breeding facilities, commonly referred to as mills. And if you're familiar at all with puppy mills, which more people are, it's the same thing, but guinea pigs, hamsters, and then wild animals like parakeets and red-eared sliders, when they're bred in these mills, they receive poor veterinary care, or rather non-existent veterinary care. They live in stressful and sanitary conditions. There's high mortality. For reptiles and amphibians, they're often packed into like dirty plastic bins or these tubs you can see a picture of that are off, that children use to swim in, and that's often how they're kept. They might be given inadequate food and water, and sick and severely injured animals may be ignored or gassed or frozen to death. Next slide. But suffering isn't just happening in these mills, it's also happening when the animals get to the pet store. So we've been working with United for Respect, a labor rights group that's been organizing with PetSmart workers under their #PetCareOverProfits campaign, which highlights the poor working conditions under BC Partners, the private equity firm that acquired PetSmart in 2015. And I can see being shared in the chat is a link where you can learn more. So insufficient training, supplies and equipment, and severe understaffing are putting workers and animals in danger. It's also hurting workers' mental health and well-being and killing animals. So an expose was released in Vice last month, which we'll also share in the chat, which is the culmination of incredible work by United for Respect that we were honored to contribute to that highlights some of these issues. And you can see listed on the slide how workers have requested sick or distressed animals be taken to the vet, but they can't because they're told, that would just waste money. Freezers of stuffed with dead animals, unsafe working conditions during a power outage that led to the deaths of reptiles and fish and put workers at risk. So I really encourage you to read that Vice article and also check out United for Respect's website. Next slide. I know I've just presented a lot of really disturbing and concerning issues. So I'm sure many of you are thinking, what can we do to help? Well, we'd encourage you to join our campaign. You can send PetSmart executives a message on our website, and all the links are about to be shared in the chat. We also have a new toolkit, Banning Retail Sales of Wild Animals, a toolkit for animal advocates that breaks down the steps of working with your city and county legislators to pass a law banning retail sales. So it goes beyond these puppy mill bills and extends to other species. In October, we're going to have a National Day of Action to pressure PetSmart that soon we'll have more information about. We have lots of other things coming up in the next few months, so I'd encourage you to join our email list. And if you have thoughts or want to get more involved or volunteer, please send me an email at the email address listed on the screen. And with that, I will turn it back to Cameron to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks so much, Liz. Next, we will hear from Karen Windsor, the co-founder and executive director of Foster Parrots and the New England Exotic Wildlife Sanctuary, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the rescue and protection of parrots, both in captivity and in the wild, and to humane education initiatives that strive to connect people to the lives and experiences of wildlife in captivity. Foster Parrots is a passionate advocate for the rights of all wild animals to be free. No cage is big enough. Karen.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Karen Windsor, and I'm the executive director of Foster Parrots. And I am here today to talk to you about parrots in the pet trade. Slide. Parrot mills are an industry standard for parrots bred for the pet trade. Large breeding ranches can hold hundreds of breeding pairs, producing hundreds or even thousands of baby parrots annually. Dozens of different species can be represented in a single breeding facility. We are outraged over puppy mills. Why on earth would this practice be acceptable for parrots? There are no witnesses, and by this, I mean that breeding facilities are rarely, if ever, officially inspected, and no visitors are allowed. Breeders insist that the presence of humans will interfere with breeding activity. I can attest to the fact that this is not true. The trick is trying to get them not to breed. Next slide. Currently, there is no legal protection under the Animal Welfare Act for parrots bred for the commercial market. However, this is about to change. After a roughly 20-year battle, the American Anti-Vivisection Society and the Avian Welfare Coalition won a lawsuit in 2020, mandating that the USDA finally draft legal standards of care for birds under the AWA. Those standards are in the process of being finalized as we speak. However, at this moment, there are no legal mandates for welfare. Anyone can breed any number of birds they like under any conditions without consequence. Breeding ranches are dismal places for parrots, as you can see here. Breeding boxes are bare-bones structures devoid of any form of enrichment. The lives of breeding birds are bleak. When eggs or babies are pulled, parrots will lay again and again to replace their stolen offspring. Parrots were not evolved to continually lay like chickens. High volume laying like this is unnatural and physically debilitating for parrots. This has been referred to as the pultrification of parrots. Nobody cares about the birds pictured here. Parrots condemned as breeding stock are not recognized as sentient beings. Their job is simply to generate a commercial product. For an animal as intelligent, as profoundly social, and as psychologically complex as a parrot, this is truly a tragedy. Next slide. This is just awful, and this demonstrates the callousness of the industry. The photos that you've seen in these first 3 slides were taken undercover at the Beaches breeding facility in Greensboro, North Carolina, which closed in 2007. It's significant to note that this breeding establishment was actually used as a teaching facility for veterinary students. So often when we're talking about parrots, the abuse can be right there in front of our eyes and we don't even see it. Next slide. In line with standard industry practice, hatchlings are pulled from their parents, packed up and shipped, oftentimes unweaned, to pet retailers like PetSmart and Petco across the country. The psychological impact on baby parrots is significant and long-term. The premise has been that hand feeding is necessary in order to produce a tame pet who will bond more strongly to its human guardian. This is a dangerous, long-standing myth. Hand feeding practiced by poorly trained store associates or consumers puts baby birds at grave risk. Complications like crop burn, crop stasis, food aspiration, and even malnutrition can be fatal. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Small parrot species like parakeets and cockatiels are the most prevalent in the retail market and are the primary avian product sold by retail chains like PetSmart and Petco. These birds suffer some of the worst neglect and abuse as pets. Inbreeding for color mutations is widely practiced, resulting in compromised genetics, chronic health problems, and shortened lifespans. Because they are compact and affordable, they are very often impulse buys, purchased by consumers with little to no knowledge about proper bird care. Small parrots and other animals are frequently bought by parents in order to teach their children responsibility. When a child loses interest, these birds are at high risk for chronic poor care, rehoming, and death. This is not responsibility. This is the opposite of responsibility. Small parrot species like parakeets and cockatiels are hardwired to live in flocks of hundreds or even thousands and to enjoy extensive social networks with conspecifics. In captivity, these small birds are often bought as single pets and are subject to profound social isolation, sitting alone in their very small cages for their entire lives. Lastly, consumers are generally unwilling to spend more on veterinary care than the monetary value of the bird. Consequently, many captive parakeets and cockatiels are denied medical help when they need it. Next slide. Parental deprivation is standard for parrots bred as pets. This has devastating consequences for normal psychological and behavioral development. Mal-imprinting is prevalent and is actually the desired outcome for consumers desiring a cuddly pet. However, in the life of a parrot who is now confused as to what species he is, this can lead to a lifelong conflict of nature versus nurture. Parental deprivation impacts a parrot's ability to mature into a well-adjusted adult bird, resulting in a behaviorally compromised pet. The neonatal period is a critical period in the development of baby parrots. In captivity, instead of having the comfort and closeness of its mother, a baby parrot sits dismally alone in the display case of a pet store. This is traumatic for babies, and the psychological damage is permanent. Parrots deprived of their natural parents are prone to developing chronic aberrant behaviors like hyperphobic responses to new stimuli, feather destruction, sexual aggression, inappropriate and excessive vocalizations, and hypersocial dependency. All of these things can undermine their success as a pet. Please note the blue and gold macaw photo at the top. This is a baby about 2 months old. He was the raffle prize at a Florida Parrot Expo. Due to his experience in captivity, I can almost guarantee that he will ultimately end up looking like the blue and gold macaw below him. Next slide. Whether a parrot is subjected to negligence or is well cared for in captivity, feather destruction is quite common in captive parrots. Extreme self-harming behavior like self-mutilation takes it to the next level. Self-mutilation is most prevalent in large cockatoos. These birds are highly psychologically vulnerable and should not be kept as pets. Once self-mutilation begins, it is virtually impossible to stop. Parrots in the wild do not pluck and they do not self-mutilate. What you see here is a demonstration of the impact of captivity on this Moluccan cockatoo. Next slide. Wild-caught parrots who had the benefit of being raised by their natural parents have their sense of species identification intact and are more psychologically stable than hand-raised parrots. Many parrots bred for the pet trade somehow emerge from the commercial breeding machine as psychologically stable, reasonably well-adjusted birds, and are eager to have human companionship. So what could go wrong? Natural parrot behavior is generally incompatible with human expectations of how a pet should behave. All parrots are loud. All parrots make noise. Their natural vocalizations are engineered to carry across miles so that they can keep in contact with flock mates or mates. In our living rooms, this kind of volume, it's not okay. Territoriality and aggression are natural behaviors that aid a parrot's survival in the wild. These birds are wired to claim a mate, locate nesting territory, and to defend these possessions against all intruders. When a pet parrot chooses one of its human guardians as a mate and becomes aggressive to all other members of the household, this is a behavior that is not well tolerated in home environments. Parrots are also super destructive. Their beaks were designed to excavate tree cavities and chew through hard nutshells. This aids them in the wild, but when one's antique armoire is excavated or one's couch is redesigned, like the one pictured here, humans don't like that. Next slide. Parrots kept as pets have a built-in homelessness factor. Sooner or later, the vast majority of parrots kept as pets will lose their homes, often repeatedly. It is not uncommon for a parrot to be rehomed between 3 and 5 times within the first 10 years of its life. Noise and aggression can be factors, but these are not even the most prevalent reasons for the loss of a home, according to our records. Changes in the lives of human guardians weigh in heavily, with human health issues, aging, and death of a guardian topping our charts. Guilt and no time come in second as reasons why a guardian seeks to surrender a pet parrot. Empathetic guardians begin to realize that keeping a flighted wild animal in a cage is simply cruel. They contact us because they want their parrot to fly free with other parrots. What they don't understand is that their hand-raised parrot does not know how to live with other birds. Next slide. Possibly the most significant impact of the commercial trade in parrots is on the survival of parrot species in the wild on a global scale. It is the legal trade in parrots that fuels illegal poaching and trapping activity that is decimating parrot populations in the wild. Of the roughly 365 or so different species of parrot on this planet, 1/3 of all parrots are listed as threatened, endangered, or critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. 1/2 of all parrot species are in decline. As long as parrots are regarded as pets, as long as demand is perpetuated by consumers, parrots in the wild will be at risk. The lovely birds on the right there are residents at foster parrots, both representing critically endangered species in the wild. The smaller of the two is Volan, a blue-throated macaw. There are perhaps not more than 200 of these left in their native range in Bolivia. Next slide. And this is the last slide. I included this photo as a point of reference. This is what the life of a parrot should look like. Parrots do matter and they do suffer in captivity. Remember, no cage is big enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Next, we will hear from Emily Hovermail, the Director of Government Affairs at the Humane Rescue Alliance, which has protected and cared for the animals of the nation's capital for more than 150 years. Emily leads the work on HRA's legislative initiatives to protect animals and support families as part of the organization's mission to advocate for positive change to create a world where all animals can thrive. Emily uses her decade-long experience in government relations to fight for strong animal welfare laws, successfully leading the charge on state and local legislative campaigns to close loopholes in animal cruelty laws, add protections for native wildlife, and take a stand against national industrialized animal cruelty. Thanks for being here, Emily.
Thank you, Cameron. Next slide. So as Cameron mentioned, I'm Emily Hovermail. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the Humane Rescue Alliance in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact on animal shelters that we see specifically in D.C. For having small wild animal species readily available as pets. Next slide. So to put things in context a little bit, the DC law on wild animal ownership actually is a bit more restrictive than many other jurisdictions. It comes from the perspective of naming explicitly the animals that are allowed, that are permitted to be possessed, to be owned as pets or to be offered for sale within the district, whereas many jurisdictions come from the opposite perspective and making restrictions on ownership of animals and prohibiting which animals are allowed to be owned. The legislation in DC, the law in DC, comes from the opposite perspective of specifically enumerating the animals that are permitted to be pets. So it's relatively strict in comparison to other jurisdictions, but still allows for sale and ownership of many small wild animal species, particularly turtles and birds. And because of the way that the law is structured in coming from a permissive standpoint instead of a prohibitive standpoint, in order to have additional species added to the list of permitted animals to own, new legislation has to be introduced. And we did see that come about in 2018 when an attempt to allow hedgehogs was included, just tacked on to an unrelated bill that was on protections for vulnerable people against financial exploitation. But ultimately, through our advocacy efforts and the efforts of many other advocates, we were able to have that struck and removed and defeated. Next slide. So as I mentioned, because we have this sort of restrictive legislation in DC in terms of the animals that are permitted, we do still see illegal wild animals at our DC shelter. Our intake regularly includes animals that were kept as pets, but are not permitted in DC, including arachnids, lizards, and larger reptiles. These are a particular challenge because they require placement outside of the city, oftentimes depending on the species outside of our entire region, and coordination with wildlife centers. All of these folks, all these little cuties on the screen right now are animals that we've had in our shelter, illegal wild animals at the DC shelter. The black scorpion actually is a stray scorpion that we found at large in DC. Obviously, these are not native to the District of Columbia. It was somebody's pet, and as so often happens when maybe the novelty wears out or the difficulty is realized in taking care of some of these wild animals, the owner likely released them into the wild thinking that that was a good option. So ended up at our shelter like so many others. Next slide. So we also see, as I said, a lot of different kinds of illegal wildlife pets. We had a seizure in 2018. This is a case example where we had received an anonymous tip that a resident had an alligator in their DC home. When our officers arrived on the scene, they found a 5-foot alligator confined to a Rubbermaid plastic container in just a couple of inches of water. When we brought the alligator to a conservation center, their rehabilitator found that the alligator's bone structure showed abnormal curvature of the lower jaw that was caused by chronic inadequate space. So next slide, we're going to actually see a little bit of the video of that seizure. So there's no sound, we're just going to see our officers kind of going. So you can see this is just a regular home in DC. And while it is illegal to have alligators as pets in the district, it is not illegal everywhere. for everywhere in the United States to have an alligator as a pet. And this is not the only alligator that we've had at the Humane Rescue Alliance. We actually had one just this month from a resident who apparently was unfamiliar with the laws in DC and had the alligator. So you can see here, this was the condition that this guy was being forced to live in this little Rubbermaid container in just that small amount of water. And so our officers seized him. They're not allowed to have the alligator, and he was also being treated cruelly. So we can stop the video. The rescue goes on as there were some other animals in the home, but just to give a little bit of perspective, we do see all animals at our shelter. So we are an open admission shelter. We accept all animals. So also small wild animals are a regular part of our intake. Those that are legal to have in the district, they require, of course, our specialized care and adopter education. And the largest population of our surrendered small wild animals by far are aquatic turtles. Next slide. So to talk a little bit more about the turtle issue that we see in our shelters, we get between 50 and 70 aquatic turtles surrendered to the shelter every year. These turtles are mainly red-eared sliders. And as Liz mentioned, turtles are readily accessible to consumers in the retail space. They're really heavily marketed as easy pets. They can often be purchased for as little as $25. And they are just really seen as something that can be an easy first-time pet. But as a result of all of that, red-eared sliders are the most frequently surrendered pet turtle. So they are eventually grow, when they're purchased, they're just over 4 inches. They're these cute little guys. Eventually they'll be 3 times that size. They grow rather quickly. They really do require specialized care and treatment. And they also live a long time. Their average lifespan is between 15 and 25 years, and they can live much longer. So many consumers who are just picking up this animal thinking that it's going to be an easy pet are really not warned and aware of the real commitment that they're making in purchasing a turtle. And that's why we see them so often showing up at our shelter. Next slide. And we also see these turtles often in our cruelty cases as well. So at the Humane Rescue Alliance, we do humane law enforcement. And this is, the turtles are often seen with other animals in large-scale cruelty cases. Turtles who have been kept as pets may develop acute health problems due to inadequate care. It's often, again, so easy to acquire them and so little information is provided about their necessary care that it's easy for them to become victims of having inadequate care. So you can see a couple of the turtles that we have seized in cruelty situations in recent years. The turtle on the right has some shell degradation, most likely caused by ammonia issues in the water, so an improperly cleaned tank that was causing the ammonia to build up and actually wear away at this turtle shell. And in the other picture, it's really sad to see. It almost looks like a snowy day, but it's an incredibly dirty tank, and you can see there is a little face there. Someone is living in that. And so we see these animals also in our cruelty cases and take those in at the shelter as well. Next slide. So as a direct result of the issues that we see with the aquatic turtle population in DC, the Humane Rescue Alliance made the decision to have include a provision in our animal welfare package that we're working on this year at the DC Council, the Animal Care and Control Omnibus Amendment Act of 2021. There is a retail sales restriction provision that originally was drafted to just include dogs and cats. And when we took a look at the issues that we're actually seeing at our shelter, we decided that we really needed to include the sale of aquatic turtles in there as well. So pet stores could still feel free to source from shelters and rescues that have a plethora of these turtles available for consumers who want to take on that responsibility, but trying to end this sort of overall just letting everybody get these animals and not knowing the proper care for them, and the issues that we see with their ending up in our shelter. This legislation also has support from our local wildlife rehabilitators as a result of the impact on our native wildlife species. As Liz also talked about, these are very resilient. They're considered one of the most, the red-eared sliders in particular, are considered one of the most invasive species in the United States. And they're very good at being competitive with native wildlife species, competing with them for resources and food, for laying space, and also having that issue of transmitting disease. So the effort is really supported by wildlife rehabilitators as well. So the legislation had a hearing at the end of February, and we're waiting further action from the committee. There's been some interest from advocates in an effort to expand the list of covered animal species to include more small wildlife species. So we'll see if the council has an interest in taking that up as part of this package, or maybe in the future. But in any event, there's a lot of activity and enthusiasm around this issue in the DC area. And so that's great to see the helpful momentum moving forward on this issue in DC. Next slide. So this is my last slide, and this is my contact information. If you do have any questions about the legislation or about our work at the Humane Rescue Alliance, please feel free to email me. If you live in DC and you're interested in getting involved, you can definitely reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thanks again to Karen and to Liz, just such great presentations. I'm going to have all the presenters turn their cameras on, and we're going to have a little bit of time for a Q&A. As a reminder, there's the Q&A function down at the bottom next to the chat function, where you can ask your questions of the presenters. But first and foremost, a question for both Emily and Karen, and perhaps we can have Karen answer first. How did you first get involved in the work that you're doing now? So Karen, we'll start with you. I think you might be on mute, Karen.
Of course I'm muted. Interestingly, I bought my first parrot in a yard sale, and this was a lilac crown Amazon, which is now a highly endangered species in the wild. And that was in California. I moved to Massachusetts. I read about Mark Johnson, the founder of foster parrots, in the newspaper, and I thought this was what I needed to do.
And I have always been interested in doing government relations. That's what I went to school for, and have always been, volunteering at my local shelters the entire time. When I saw the opportunity to kind of bridge the nexus, and I saw a job opening at the Humane Society of the United States doing policy work for animals, I said, hooray, policy work for animals. That sounds like exactly what I was built to do. So that's kind of how I got into the work, just volunteering at animal shelters and looking for the chance to move and my skills into my work.
That's great, and certainly inspiring for our attendees as well. Another question for Emily while we have you. What can people do, either those who join the call or those just in the general public, to support their local shelters, particularly in protecting wild animals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that probably all of the shelters everywhere have different challenges and experience similar things that we have. If you have expertise and ability to foster any of these animals, I think that's always really appreciated. It can be very difficult to find well-suited fosters who have experience taking care of some of these wild animals. So we really hold on to our turtle fosters very dearly because we get so many folks, so many turtles in. When I say folks, I meant turtles. And so I think that's the #1 way to directly help them with these issues in terms of helping and similar legislative campaigns, I think that probably the toolkit from World Animal Protection is going to help with like guiding people to do that. I think that getting involved and seeing what your local shelter is doing in those efforts is a great thing to do. Just kind of connect the dots and see if they're interested in being supportive of doing a campaign.
Thanks, Emily. A question for Karen. What are some of the biggest challenges that foster parrots faces?
I think that probably our biggest challenge is the sheer volume. Parrots are, I believe, the most widely traded of all exotic animals in the pet trade, wild animals in the pet trade. And people's perception of parrots is that they belong in cages, is that they are pets. And so many people just, they can't live with them. Or they live with them for most of their lives, and the care is really poor. And by the time that guardian ages out or dies and we step in, we have found that even this well-loved parrot has received absolutely dismal care. People don't know how to take care of parrots, and there are so many of them, and it's hard to convince the public that the animal that they've been seeing in cages for decades, and I guess maybe even centuries, doesn't belong in a cage.
Thanks so much, Karen. A question for all panelists. What are the chances PetSmart and/or Petco will change their business models and stop carrying wild animals for sale?
Oh, Karen, do you want to start? Yeah.
Well, actually, I'd just love to address that, because years ago, Foster Parrots was involved in the Pet No campaign. And we put a lot of pressure on Petco to stop selling parrots in their stores. And they actually did that. And they stopped selling large parrots. So they only sell small parrots. But a small parrot is just a really large parrot in a very small body. And there's no difference in how they suffer and the way that they're cared for. So thank you for not selling cockatoos, I guess, but the problems still exist, and it's awful.
Yeah, just to add on that, obviously we can't predict the future, but at World Animal Protection, this is something we're campaigning on, and we certainly don't take on campaigns that we think we will ultimately lose. I do think this is going to be, it's going to require a lot of support from people, because this is an issue that people aren't aware of, so that's what we're trying to do, is increase people's awareness. You can see, like with the puppy mill issue, a lot of people really understand puppy mills now. The problem still persists. They're still being sold in some stores. So the great work is being done, like by HSUS, to stop that. So I think this is a long journey, but especially with things like with the COVID-19 pandemic and concerns about the wildlife, that we're well positioned to move these corporations.
Thanks so much. There's a couple of questions that are about kind of current policy and legislation that I'm going to try to combine in the moment into kind of a single question. So currently, thinking about policies that impact the sale of wild animals at retail stores, are these laws that vary state by state? And is there work towards a federal piece of legislation that would protect these animals and prevent these sales?
I'll just say that, so there's not federal work going on, like federal work regarding retail sale of wild animals. We're really focused at the local level, and then DC, well, I guess it's touchy if it's local or state, but DC is probably like the biggest jurisdiction who's taking this issue on. But in terms of why we're not looking federal level, it's just so difficult. And I'm by no means an expert in federal legislation, but if you look at something like the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which we're also advocating for, we're talking about tigers, and that has languished in Congress for years. And these are tigers where it's very clear, like the tiger people have died. And it's just a really tough issue. And that's why we're looking at the local level. And I don't know, Emily, if you can shed any light on, local, state and its chances and why local might be better in some cases for various issues.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, Liz, because, one, I think that a lot of times this type of legislative action is actually the purview of the either, local jurisdictions or state legislatures, state legislative bodies, just like that is more so the purview of those bodies, to work on these kind of sales-based restrictions. And so I think that focusing like on DC, for example, we feel pretty good about our chances of passing this bill during this legislative session. We've had some really good conversations with the committee members and the chair. And so I think that it helps always to kind of gain momentum also by passing these bills in some larger jurisdictions like a DC, currently, a city, but hopefully a state before too long, and then moving that forward to other places as well. So I think we always gain momentum whenever we pass one of these in like a place where we feel pretty confident that we can get it through, and that helps move the ball forward and gain momentum on these initiatives.
I would love to comment on this. On the federal level, as has been mentioned, if so many states allow people to have a tiger in their backyard, what chance do parrots have of ever being regulated on the federal level? But it's important to recognize that on a state by state or federal level, there are really, there's big, well-funded opposition to legalization or to legal standards or regulation. In some of these, for parrots, the American Federation of Aviculture, parrots have not been regulated ever. And these people do not want to see any form of regulation put into place because that may open the floodgates. Another really dangerous organization is the NAIA, that's the National Animal Interest Alliance. They claim to represent the wonderful dynamic in the relationships between animals and people. That is not the case. They are there to make sure that people can do and use animals in any way they please. They are big opponents of things like regulations on bull hooks for elephants, and battery cages for chickens, gestation crates for pigs. These are the people that come out against legislation that protects animals. And then lastly, of course, the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Committee, PJAC, huge. I mean, this is the pet trade, and they are not going to let anybody interfere with their bottom line, with their profit.
Thanks so much all for those very thoughtful responses. There's a suggestion in the Q&A about focusing on billboard promos to educate the public about this issue. So I'm interested in maybe a broader question about what are some important tactics for raising awareness about this and educating people about the need to protect these animals.
I think that one of our biggest focuses is really getting into schools and talking to children, because when you teach a child empathy, to empathize with an animal and to understand the impact of captivity on an animal, they're a great audience, and they take what they have learned and they bring it home. And also, teaching a child empathy has an impact on how they teach other children as well. But the younger people, I think, getting into the schools and getting into the colleges and universities and really talking to as many people as possible to change minds and perspectives about animals in captivity, parrots in captivity.
Yeah, I would just add to that. That's one of the reasons we invited Karen and Emily today, because they're working with these animals. And I think that's a really powerful way to educate people when we have these real life stories and we know how these animals are being impacted. For those of us who don't work in shelters, or like myself, who work at an advocacy organization, we try to put out resources you can share. We have a really cool resource for kids that's coming out soon. So I hope you join our email list to receive that, and some other fun things coming up, or not so fun. That one's fun, but other activities that are more advocacy focused. I think if you share like our campaign with PetSmart, that's an advocacy tool, but it's also an educational opportunity for someone to say, wait, I thought they were doing so much, good work on behalf of adopting cats and dogs. I didn't realize this. So I think getting active either from the advocacy side or the shelter or sanctuary side are all really important.
Thanks, Liz. And that lends itself well to a question on what activities upcoming in the PetSmart campaign can you maybe give a sneak peek to our attendees about?
Yeah, so we have the resource for kids coming out. We have a new interactive report that will be coming out in later this month or in May. We'll also be expanding our campaign over the summer to include other retailers. And then we have this PetSmart Day of Action, which I'm not being that purposely vague. The details haven't been hammered out, but we are looking at October 21st, which is National Reptile Awareness Day, for everyone to come together and take an action or do something to tell PetSmart that, we don't support these policies and we want them to protect the animals in their stores and the workers in their stores, to reference back to the Vice article, because it's not just animals who are being impacted by these corporate policies that are fueled by greed. Humans and animals are being negatively impacted. So we do have a lot of stuff coming up, and we also welcome your suggestions or ideas. So earlier in the chat or on a slide, we had the email address, and again, feel free to email. I see lots of questions coming in through the chat, and I can't type and speak at the same time. I think Emily and Karen probably can't either. So if you have any lingering questions, please feel free to email us.
Yeah, that's a great point, Liz. There's a very robust conversation going on in the chat, and very much appreciate everyone's input. And we will be sharing the recording of this webinar via email afterwards. I think we have time for just one quick response, rapid fire question from each of the panelists to end on a positive note. What is something that makes you optimistic about the future on this issue?
It makes me optimistic. I don't know if everyone just saw this article about children who have very different perceptions of animals, especially farmed animals, on a bit unrelated note than adults. So I'm really optimistic about how children are going to perceive these issues, and I think they're going to do a better job than we're doing.
I would say that the response to our inclusion of the aquatic turtles in our pet store sales restrictions, the very positive response really does give me a lot of hope. There's been a very positive response from the council and from advocates, and we weren't entirely sure, how it would be received, just in all candidness, because as Liz mentioned, people seem very familiar with the issues with puppy mills and, dog kitten mills, but are less familiar with some of the issues for other species of animals commonly sold in pet stores. And the response and the positivity around it really makes me hopeful for this issue.
Yeah, I feel optimistic sometimes on some level, just after 25 or so years of doing this work. I think that people's values and attitudes have changed, and very often people tell us, oh no, I could never put a bird in a cage, or parrots are way too hard to take care of, and they shouldn't be pets. So we're getting a lot of feedback like that, and that just means that we're doing our job and we need to keep going.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. We need to keep going. Thank you again to all three of our panelists. I'm going to ask for a transition to the next slide. and wrap things up. Thank you everyone for joining us and giving us your time and hearing this presentation. Again, this has been recorded and we'll be sending this around. We'll also go through and look at all those links and suggestions that have come through the chat and the Q&A. There's of course ways to continue taking action for wild animals. Help us tell PetSmart to stop treating animals like commodities. Sign our Wildlife Not Pets pledge and become a supporter of World Animal Protection. The QR code is a quick way to become a supporter, and there's also links being placed in the chat as we speak for everyone. So with that, just want to say thank you again to everyone involved and here presently, and we hope to see you on our next webinar.